exciting guest. I've been looking forward to having President Caslen on the podcast for a while. Tell the listeners who President Caslen even is.
Yeah, so he is a retired Army Lieutenant General, former superintendent of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He is now the 29th president of U of SC here in Columbia. That is where me and Joseph go to school, so he is our president. And he recently published The Character Edge, which is an awesome book that me and Joseph spent some time reading over the past couple of weeks, explaining why a person's character is so vital to being a successful leader. And I think that ties into pretty much what we're talking about on this podcast each week, and talking about courage a little bit.
Yeah.
And President Caslen has had a lot of experience dealing with courage, and so we are super excited to have him on the podcast today.
Mm-hmm. So President Caslen, we want to welcome you on the podcast, and we also want to give you a little bit of rundown of just like why we even do the podcast. And so the title of the podcast is 5 Seconds of Courage, sharing how 5 seconds of a bold, courageous decision can change your life and potentially the lives of other people for good. And not that it's like, all right, you got to make a courageous decision in 5 seconds, but the 5 seconds piece is really like the mental commitment to commit to the courageous decision, or the commitment to live boldly. And so that's kind of about that. And so we really admire you, and I even admire you going to your workouts in the morning. You know, I'm supposed to be in my prime. That's what science says, I guess. I'm about to be 21 years old, so between 21, 25, I'm supposed to be in my prime, and you made me look like a fool at those 6 a.m. workouts, so I admire you for that. But we want to get started in just like big picture courage. You want to talk to him about that, buddy?
Yeah, so this is going to be, for our listeners out there, and for you, President Caslen, this is going to be very question, response, and then dialogue for a little bit after. That is how we think it will go best and just kind of flow for this episode. And so we're just going to ask you a couple questions throughout the whole time, get your answer, and then we'd love to open a little bit of dialogue talking about that. So our first question, because we believe that when you have to display courage, you have to have some type of adversity, fear, or be in some type of danger beforehand to cause that reaction of stepping into making a courageous decision. And so, has there been a time in your life, or there probably has, but where were you most afraid, and how did you see courage play out in that, or how did you not see courage play out in that in a time in your life?
Well, first, Joseph, and I appreciate very much both of you guys having me on the show. It's really an honor to be here, and anytime I can talk about leadership and courage as an essential element of character being so important part of leadership, I think I'll clear the calendar for that. That's just great opportunity to do that. Thanks for what you do on that 5 second commitment to do the right thing. You know, a 5 second commitment to courage. So I got your bracelet right here.
Let's go. Hey, that's what I like to see.
And so it's, but that's really, you know, you're talking about 5 seconds. The way I look at it is, you know, courage is always doing the right thing, especially when no one's looking.
Oh, yeah.
And when no one's looking and you are faced with what's right or what's not right, you have the courage to do the right thing. And that's really that really is a defining moment of your character, in my opinion. So I love this very much because it reminds you to take a breath, think about what the right thing to do is, and then do the right thing. Wow. So I guess if you ask the question, where in my life I was most afraid, there's no shortage of those that are out there. You know, everybody gets afraid. It's not so much that you're afraid, it's how you react when you are faced with something that you're afraid with, you know, and you have the courage, both the moral courage and the physical courage to proceed. And I'll talk a little bit about moral courage and physical courage here a little bit later, because I think you got some questions about that, and it's an important distinction because most of us in our age that are not in physical challenging circumstances are constantly faced with moral courage decisions, more so than with physical courage. But, you know, 30 years ago, we were in the middle of Desert Shield, Desert Storm. I had been there from the early on as the line in the stand, one of those troops that went out there. We had planned for the offensive operation for at least 6 months. Our planning said that we were going to have 65% casualties because we were flying in a helicopter and we were flying over enemy forces, and they were very vulnerable. So our mission was to go 165 miles behind enemy lines to go to a bridge and blow the bridge up. so that as they were coming out of Kuwait, they hit the bridge, they couldn't go anywhere. Our armor forces would come up and destroy as many of them as we can. So that was known as the Highway of Death, and it worked perfectly. So getting in that helicopter at at 6 o'clock in the morning, flying all the way 165 miles behind enemy lines over enemy forces, knowing that you were very vulnerable. So you're kind of afraid, sort of thing. So, but it doesn't matter at that point. You think about your own mortality, and we had been planning for that mission, like I said, for a number of months. And no matter what level of leadership you're at, when you're faced with the thought of losing your life, and you become faced with your own mortality. And when you become faced with your own mortality, you put that aside. And when you're able to put that aside, then you can go forward and do what you have to do. And so that was, it wasn't so much getting the helicopter that you're afraid. You start to deal with being afraid when you start the planning process, when you realize that your planning assumptions have such high casualty rates, and you're probably going to be in the middle of it.
Yeah. Man, when you were looking at those statistics and the 65% casualty rate, what made you still get on that helicopter?
Well, so I was the second in command at that point. So you're a leader, and you have to lead from the front. You have to lead by example. You can't go in the back. You have to be up front.
Yeah.
And not only that, here's an interesting dynamic. When we first put the manning into the helicopter together, I found that all the senior non-commissioned officers were going in last on the second leg, not the first leg. And I told the commander, I said, this is unsatisfactory. These men must be in the front, leading from the front, because all those soldiers are going to watch their leaders, and they're going to do what their leaders do. And in the crucible of ground combat, leadership makes a difference. And leadership comes from the assigned leaders. And when the assigned leaders found themselves going in the second wave, not the first wave, we stopped all that craziness. We took the senior non-commissioned officer and we put him in the first helicopter. And then for every other subordinate organization, we put their senior non-commissioned officer in the lead helicopter of their unit. And we did that intentionally because we wanted to ensure that leaders were putting themselves in as vulnerable a position as the men that they were leading. And leadership in those type of circumstances, you have to lead from the front, you have to share hardships, and you have to be out front. And you have to lead physically, because you're going to lose sleep, and you're in the middle of a desert, so you're going to have to be in physical shape. That's what we did. So there was no shortage of leadership going in front, right up front.
Yeah. I just read a book by Jocko Willink called Extreme Ownership, and that talks like that. It reminded me of that book. It's like, as the leader, you have to take ownership and be courageous. Like, it doesn't matter if you're more afraid than the guys you're leading, but as the leader, you got to be able to set the example and go forward, like you were saying. I love that so much. Our next question, kind of going in off that, tell us about a time in your life where maybe you were most afraid, but where you exhibited the most amount of courage.
Well, just being there. Courage is just being there when you need to be there. And it doesn't necessarily mean in harm's way or when there's a physical challenge. There might be a moral challenge or just some really devastating circumstances. I remember when I was in charge of northern Iraq during the Iraqi War, in Mosul, the most dangerous part in all of Iraq at the time, one of my subordinate commanders was killed. He was beloved by his soldiers, and he was an incredibly competent commander. And if you read my book, that's the preface of the book. Gary Derby is his name. That battalion was devastated when they lost their leader like him, and one who they just admired and respected. It was devastating. So I got on a helicopter, I flew up there, I sat down with the senior leadership, put my arm around them. It was not that I had to tell them what to do. You just have to be there, and you have to share the sorrow of what actually occurred with them. and tell them it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Give them that level of reassurance. You know, facing someone who has just gone through a devastating situation, and outside of a combat zone, it's like a friend who lost a friend, or someone who really lost, or a father who lost a son or daughter, and then going to go see that father and put your arm around them and say, I'm sorry, I'm here for you. And that people in those type of situations, they don't want to go forward, because you don't know what you're going to be facing, but it takes courage to be able to do that. Same thing in supervisory responsibilities. There's hiring and there's firing responsibilities. When you sit down and look someone in the eye and say, okay, not, we're going to have to go with somebody else, I'm sorry. And you make those sort of decisions. It takes courage to look that person in the eye and to be able to pass that message to them.
That's awesome. I think that ties a lot in when you were talking about just the day-to-day encouragement and the day-to-day. It's more of this like morality to, hey, we're going to be courageous each day. Like it's not like, yes, me and Joseph were talking in one of our podcasts, like in life you have probably about 10, and for some people there's more depending on what their job is and what they do for a living. But you have 10 big events, big decisions in your life where you really have to display courage, moving from job to job, doing big things like that, who you're going to marry, like really stepping into those decisions. But we're trying to break courage down into more of a day-to-day thing too, where it's like, hey, we want to create this culture that just makes courageous decisions, encourages each other, exactly what you were just talking about. And so kind of moving into our next questions too, now as you are the president of USC, or even in the past season as you were the superintendent at West Point, how do you see courage, whether it's moral or physical, play out in your day-to-day life?
Well, it's mostly moral courage, and moral courage is, as we said before, moral courage is doing the right thing when no one's looking. And so what is the right thing? The right thing is normally defined by a set of values. In the University of South Carolina, our values are defined by our Carolinian Creed. And this is a great creed, and I'm not sure how many students have taken a look at it, but it really embraces a set of values that are very important. So I got it right here. I keep my creed right next to me so I can read it. I'll practice personal and academic integrity. I'll respect the dignity of all persons. I'll respect the rights and properties of others. I will discourage bigotry, striving to learn from differences in people, ideas, and opinions. I'll demonstrate concern, empathy for others, their feelings, and their need for conditions which support their work and development. So you got some values that are embedded in there: integrity, respect, dignity. I will discourage bigotry. That's moral courage, right? And embracing ideas and demonstrating concern is empathy. Anyway, so there are values that are embedded in here that really define your left and right limits of what acceptable and unacceptable behavior are. Sometimes you're going to find yourself on the other side of that. You're going to read something on social media that's going to discourage you, and you're going to want to honestly spit something out there that is in violation to what we believe as right. So do you have the moral courage to be able to say, hey, is this the right thing to do? Is this in accordance with the values that I've signed up for the institution that I'm a part of? Institutions have values, and whether you know it or not, every individual has a set of values. You have developed those set of values from your upbringing. You developed those set of values from your mom and dad, from your families, from the school, the teams you were on, the clubs you were a part of, and those values shape your personality. And it's good to stop and say, what are the values that I live by? Because moral courage is when I find myself outside that value set, am I going to do the right thing, or am I going to do the right thing and come back into the acceptable left and right limits of my value set, or am I going to do the wrong thing and go outside there? So that's the day-to-day challenge that all of us have. And not only do you have it as a 21-year-old, I have it as a 67-year-old as well, because those challenges of acceptable, unacceptable behavior, actions inside, outside of value sets are as prevalent at my age as they are with you. As you go through life, you're going to be challenged constantly on what are your values and how are you going to respond to a temptation outside your value set.
That's good. I like that too. Even talking about you're a big advocate of like that moral courage and character, like the day-to-day decisions to be courageous and make the courageous decision. And sometimes even tying into what you're talking about a little bit with the Carolinian Creed, it's having the courage to not do something is just as important as having the courage to take that step and do something. And those little day-to-day courageous decisions turn into the big picture of like, what am I personally known for? What I'm known for in my life altogether is made up by little day-to-day decisions. And oftentimes those require courage. Hold up. Okay, the episode is not quite over. Okay, this is the end of part 1. We got part 2 coming next Monday. All right, so make sure you take out the old calendar and you mark it down because we got some awesome information left that President Caslen shared with us for episode 2, part 2 with President Caslen.
Sweet. Y'all have a great week. Stay tuned.